Welcome to the short introduction of the Westwind.Globalization library. This library provides database resource localization for your .NET applications and your ASP.NET applications in particular. It allows you to store resources in a database like SQL Server, MySQL, SQLite, or SQL CE, and you can extend it with your own providers that you can create. Let's get started by creating a new Visual Studio project. So let's create an ASP.NET web application and an empty project, and let's let it generate. Of course, you can add Westwind.Globalization to any type of project, any type of web project. So it works with MVC application, WebForms applications, WebPages. You can also use it in non-web projects where you can use the localization provider to access database resources from a console application or a service, for example. Once you have a project that you want to work with, you can add some NuGet references. So I'm going to search for Westwind.Globalization as a filter. And we should find three different packages. There's the core package, the web package, and then the starter package. We're going to choose the starter package here, which includes all the web features as well as some sample resources that you can play around with. OK. We can now examine and see what's actually been added to your project. So the most important pieces are the Westwind.Globalization library and the Westwind.Globalization assembly. Those two libraries contain the core functionality, which is the database access mechanism, as well as the resource manager that you can use in any type of application. The web package then contains also an ASP.NET resource provider, as well as the functionality required to handle the backend application for editing resources inline and providing a number of ASP.NET specific features for WebForms, for example. There's also a localization admin folder that's been added to your web application. And this folder basically contains a self-contained resource editor that you can use to edit and update resources interactively in your application. The starter package also added a test script, and a test script can be used to make sure that the provider is working, and it also gives you an opportunity to play around with some of the sample resources that were installed. Finally, some changes were also made to your web.config file. If you scroll down to the globalization section, you'll see that the resource provider factory type has been replaced with DB Simple Resource Provider Factory, which is one of the database resource providers from Westwind.Globalization. Essentially, what this says is that anywhere where the ASP.NET resource provider is used, instead of using resx resources, we're now going to use the DB Simple Resource Provider Factory and get resources from a database. The other important thing inside of here is the DB resource configuration, where you need to configure how that server is set up. Here you configure which database you're connecting to and which table to go to, where resources are located, how the importers and exporters work, and so forth. So the most important value here is the connection string and the resource table name. So the first thing I'm going to do is cheat a little bit here and paste in some connection strings. So for the connection string, you can either use a raw connection string or you can use a connection string name. So I'm just going to copy this and paste this in here. So I'm using this connection string here, and it's pointing at a database called localizations, but I'm going to change that to localizations too, as this is a database that I previously set up. So what I'm telling it here is that when we're looking for database resources, go out and look into a database in the localizations too. So if I go over to SQL Server and refresh here, you can see that I've created a database, but there's nothing in there yet. Now you can use any database that you choose. And of course, you don't have to use SQL Server. You can use MySQL, SQLite, and SQL CE as well. And you can create your own providers to connect to other databases. So I'm going to use SQL Server since that's probably the most common. So anyway, there's a database here, and we have it configured with a connection string. So now in order to do anything here, we should probably compile this project first. So we've added some references, and we've also added some code, essentially. And without compilation, that code doesn't actually run and work. So the next step that I do then is I am going to bring up the localization administration form. And we're going to do that in order to actually create our resources. So the way that I do this is go to the localization admin folder, bring up the index page, and view in browser. And there you go. So the form comes up and it comes up empty, and there's actually an error there. It says resource set loading failed, invalid object name localizations. And that actually makes perfect sense, right? We don't have a localizations table yet because there is none in the database. So I can click this create table button, and now it has actually created for me a resource set with two resource sets inside of it and a number of preset resources that we can use for quick testing. So now we have actually some resources that we can work with. So I can go in here, for example, and make a change to this and save and save this value, go back down and see. So this is writing values to the database. If we go back over to SQL Server now and we refresh here and we look at the tables, and let's select 1000 records here and move this up a bit, you can see that there is some resources that have been added to the database. And as you can see, these reflect pretty much what you would expect in a resource table. So there's the 5 or so resources that are in the resource set, and that one resource in the other resource set. So we got these 4 here, and here's the other resource set, which is that single symbol value. So if I want to go and add a new resource to the resources data set, I simply can go in here and say ready. And then click save to actually save that value. And I can go in here and then just type into the German one and add that value. Or I can also go in here and say, I want to translate that. And then it goes out and translates that value for me. Now that doesn't happen to be the value that I want here. So let's actually go to French and translate that. I don't think that's right either, but I'm just gonna, I think it's LA. My French isn't very good. Somebody's probably gonna call me out on that. And there we go. So now we have a new value that we've added here that actually exists and that we can use in our resources. We can also add new resource sets altogether. So let's create a common words and let's put in save maybe, and let's call it save. Okay, so I've created a new resource set here, and notice we're now in a new resource set. So then I can say translate that. And in this case, I actually like what it's telling me. So I save that and go back here. And I want to go to French this time, translate, and I have no idea whether these values are good. Let's hope so. And there's that. So if I want to now add another value, it comes up with common words. I can just say cancel, save. Again, I can translate. Okay, so let's go use that in French. And then again, go in here and save that in German. Abbrechen is probably more like it, and save that. So if we go back and forth here, now we've created values that exist for these other resources. Another thing that we can do is we can import resources that already exist in your project. One of the easiest ways to do that is to use this import dialog. So where do we get these resources from? In this existing project that was created for you, there is a number of resources that were created as part of the project. So the resources for the localization form have actually been exported so that you can import it and you can have a localized experience with your localization form. We also imported additional resources in the resources file here, in this resource file, for the standard resources for testing that we were looking at. For example, there's a flag that is associated with it. Now, these resources are just for testing. You can get rid of these ones. The localization form is one that you want to kick around. But anyway, what we want to do is we can actually say that we want to import those resources into our existing resource file. So what I can do is I can choose this dialog, pick import resources, and then tell it to import all resource files that exist in that properties folder. When I do that, we now have some additional resources that came in here. So there is an address is required, there's a flag, PNG, and there's also the localization form that is now fully populated. If we go over now to our SQL Server and we look in the database here, we see that there's now over 190 rows here, which means that the database resources were imported and stored in the database. So now those resources are available to us to be used in our application. So far, we've talked about adding and editing resources and importing and exporting, but we haven't really seen the resources in action. We haven't actually seen them work. So in order to do that, let's take a look at the web application that we created again, and let's look at the resource test.aspx page. This page was added to the project by the NuGet package, and it can be used to check and see whether the application is working. Now, this is a WebForms page, but the only reason that it is a WebForms page is because that works in any type of ASP.NET project. So all these features that I'm going to demonstrate, they also work on a CS/HTML page or an MVC application, or for that matter, in a standalone application. So what we want to do here is we want to actually preview this page. So let's view this in the browser. And when this page comes up, it has a number of resources applied to it using a bunch of different approaches. So here's the DBRS approach, which is a utility class that uses this. This is using the standard ASP.NET resource provider, including meta resource tags that are something that is specific to WebForms. Strongly typed resources that are generated into code and can be called up inside of an application using strongly typed classes. Here's an example of a Markdown piece of text. And there's also some JavaScript resources that were served up from JavaScript inside of this page. So these resources all are in English, so it's hard to say that anything is really happening, but the mere fact that these values are showing up, these are the values that are actually coming from the database provider, and that tells us that it's actually working. To make this a little more explicit, let's switch the language to a different language. And so here's German. And so now you can see all the language values have changed. So we have Hallo schöne Welt here, we have the German flag, and we have our Markdown text in German, as well as the JavaScript resources that are also exported. And again, we can also switch to French, and we see the French versions of everything. Okay, so this is all working great. If the user comes in with a browser set to a different language, the application should automatically switch to that language. Now, right now, the browser is set to English, and so we see the current culture is ENUS. If I switch my language now in the browser, let's switch it to German, for example. And if I go back to this page now and refresh, I still see the current culture showing up as English. So the problem here is that we need to tell ASP.NET how to actually switch into a different language. One way we can do this is in the web.config file, and we can basically set the culture equal to auto. And so that controls the actual number formats and date formats and other system-related settings. And the UI culture, which controls the actual localization of resources. So I also set this to auto. So I saved this in the config file. We switch back to the browser. And if we refresh the page now, we should see indeed that the browser's locale, which I switched, should show up as de.de. We now have the native languages showing up. So we see our text in German because we do have German localizations for these values. So if we go to the actual localization page here, and we go to the resource page, the resources resource set, this is the hello world value. So this is our hello cruel world, and there's our values. I can now also go in and change these values. So I can say hello cruel world, and I want to also save this value. Save the English value and the German value by adding a bunch of exclamation points. Now if I go back to my page here and refresh, nothing's really changed. So why not? Well, resources are actually cached. And this demonstrates the fact that ASP.NET or .NET in general caches resources once they've been loaded once. So these resources were loaded from a database, but only one call to the database was made to actually retrieve all the resources for a given resource set and a given language. So the database isn't hit on every hit. It only gets hit the first time when you load a resource set. After that, the resources are cached. So how do we get these uncached? So natively, .NET doesn't support that for ResX resources. You have to restart the application. But using these resource providers, because we control the resource sets and the values that are being served with our own versions, we can actually say reload resources. And now if I change the value here and reload resources one more time and refresh, we should see these updated values show up immediately inside of here. So this is the German version, and if I switch back to the English version, that one too should show me those exclamation points that match to the values over here. Okay, so now let's see how we can get the values into the application. So the first one is DBRS, which is native to the Westwind.Globalization assembly. And basically, this allows you to specify a resource by string name and by resource set. So this works in any type of application. It's not tied to ASP.NET. As long as your localization provider is configured properly, it will automatically find the resource set and the resources that are configured. Now you notice in this example here, as we switch into different languages, we see that the second value here always stays on German. It never changes. Even if we go to French or English, it always comes back as German. Now the reason for that is that I've explicitly specified that I want to use the German locale here in the third parameter. Next up is the ASP.NET Resource Provider, which is the native way that ASP.NET WebForms type applications can use resources. So let's take a look at those. So the first thing is get global resource object, which is basically a string-based mechanism. So this exists on the HTTP context object or on the page object. So here you specify the resource set and the resource ID. Get local resource object is a mechanism that is based on the current page that is running. And essentially, you have a resource set that is implied here, and the resource set is implied to be named the same as the page name. So if we go over to our localization page here, and we look in our resource sets, we see here that there's a resource test.aspx page. And inside of it, it has a LBL hello world labeled.text property. So that's the property that we're actually referencing here. So then you can also use meta resource tags. Meta resource tags have a meta resource key value that exists inside of a control. And inside of it, you basically specify a resource ID minus the actual property that you want to bind to. So when we look at our property here, what we're saying is that we want to bind to the LBL hello world label control, or whatever the meta resource key mentions, and a .text property. So just to see that this works, I'm going to go in here and put my exclamation points in here, and then reload the resources. Go back to my page and look at my current get local resource object, refresh, and you can see the value is updated in both places here. So both the label, the meta resource key, and the get local resource object worked and accepted the value. So if we go back over here, take it back out, Control Enter to save, reload resources, go back over here to refresh, and we should see the updated value. Next up are strongly typed resources. Strongly typed resources allow you to use a class with resource IDs expressed as properties on them. So we have here, for example, all of these values that are in our resource set that we're referencing here. Now, when we're using resx resources, the resource editor automatically creates a backing class for this. So how do we do this with the localization administration features? So if we go back over here to our localization administration features, we know that we have a number of resource sets. If I want to export my resources to strongly typed resources, I can use the create classes button, and I can specify basically where I want to store those resources, which namespace to create. And it goes ahead and creates this. We go back into Visual Studio now, it tells me that it's generated the resources, and if I double click the file here, we can see that indeed there's our resources. So let me go in here and add another property here. So let's just add a new resource. Let's just call it new resource, and let's make it invariant and save that. Okay, so let's save that here. Reload our resources and create our resources by exporting them again. So if we look at the file here, there's our new resources that was generated. So it's automatically generated. So in order to use this now, I need to compile. If I go to resource test, I can go in here and now display that value. So equals resources. Okay, if we go refresh the page, and we should see the new value showing up immediately. Next up, we have Markdown. We can actually create Markdown text inside of our application and have that Markdown text automatically expanded as part of our resources. So if we go into our page here, you'll notice that there's nothing different here about this Markdown text. All we said is DBRS T, Markdown text, and the resources. So this text, though, is marked with a special flag inside of the administration interface. So if we go over here and we look at this, we see that we have Markdown text here. So if I want to say 1.5, 2.5, I'm going to save that. Save it. Reload resources, and if I refresh here, we should see the updated values showing up here. So you can see that we have Markdown text that is automatically converted to HTML. So how does that work? There's an actual flag here that allows us to specify that we want the text type to be Markdown. By switching this type tag to Markdown, the text is automatically validated. So inside of the database, there's essentially a flag that tells it what type of text that we're dealing with. And if it finds the Markdown tag, it automatically applies the Markdown parsing. Now, this has some pretty cool implications if you think about it. You can actually use the localization manager as a simple CMS mechanism. Finally, there's also a JavaScript resource handler that you can use to serve server-side resources into JavaScript client code. Let's take a look and see what that looks like. So here we have our JavaScript resource handler. And as you can see, there's an empty HTML tag that has no content inside of it. What we're going to do is actually load up this data with data that was retrieved from the server via resources. So the way that this works is that we can embed server-side resources into the client by using this JavaScript resource handler .get JavaScript resources URL and specifying the name of a variable to create and the resource set that we actually want to retrieve the resources from. So then once we have that, what will happen is that we will create a variable that has properties for each one of the resources in the resource set. So we get a resources.helloWorld property that allows us to embed the value into the page, and then we take that into the actual inner text. So if we refresh here, you can see the value is actually being written here. So if we go look into the browser tools here, and we refresh this page, what you'll find is that there is a URL created, a JavaScript resource handler.axd request. If you look at this, it generates this variable with all the properties that are in our resource set enabled here and accessible via properties. There's also a DBRS function that you can use that works very much like DBRS-T. So if a resource does not exist or the value is null or empty, it uses the resource ID instead of just displaying the value. So this allows us to push server-side resources into a client-side application. Note that you can control the name of the variable that is being created. So if I wanted to, I could, for example, create a global object. So if I do script and say global equals this, and then I can actually bind this to a global object. And then if I read this down here in my actual code, I can retrieve this from global.resources.helloWorld. So now if I refresh this page, this should still work. We still get our hello world value. If I refresh here now, though, we'll see that now the variable that is created is called global.resources. So this allows you to namespace and safely create variables that are not global variables. The last thing I like to show you is the ability for making resources editable on your content pages. To see an example of this, click the Edit Resources button, and you'll notice that a bunch of red flags are popping up on top of some of the editable resources. So if I click here on one of these, you can see it's pointing at a specific resource ID, and when I click, it takes me directly to that resource for editing. If I go back over here and click on the flag, for example, it takes me directly to the flag. If I go to the Markdown, it takes me to the Markdown one. So this makes it really easy to build editable links that you can jump to very quickly and localize your text. Now this doesn't happen automatically. You need to add a little bit of code to make that happen. And essentially you can mark up any HTML element simply by using the data resource ID attribute on any element that it wraps. Inside of there, you specify the resource ID, and then optionally, you also specify a data resource set with the name of the resource set. Now, the resource set can be defined on the current element or on a parent element. So here on this page, for example, I have it defined on my body tag, and essentially, the element will look up the hierarchy to try and find a data resource set attribute anywhere up the hierarchy. So if that value exists somewhere, it will show up and pick it up from the body tag. So if I move this out of here, this will still work. To demonstrate how you can use this resource editing feature, let's assume for a second that we want to localize an element that has not been localized yet. So the first thing that I'll do is I'll add the data resource ID to this particular element that I want to localize. So then I assign a resource ID and I save. So then I can go back to my page here, and if I now go Edit Resources, that resource icon pops up. So now I can click on this form, and it will automatically bring up the resource editor. And because the resource doesn't exist, it asks me to create a new one. It automatically picks up the resource set, the resource ID, and if possible, the text, the content for that particular control. So I'm going to go Save, and we've just essentially saved this. So just for kicks, I'm going to translate this, and let's just assume this is right. Save that. And let's change this by adding the quintessential exclamation points, reload my resources, and then go back into the code because we haven't actually translated this object. So if I want to use this now, I have to actually embed the resources inside of here. So I can say dbres.t and using dbres access, and then the name of the resource set, which is resources. So if I save that now, go back over and refresh the page, there's our content, and you can see I have the 3 exclamation points. If I go Edit Resources, click this element, make the change, save it, reload resources, go reload the page, you can see now the updated code has been updated. So this concludes this tour of the Westwind Globalization Library. I hope you found this useful, and if you did, come visit us on the web at west-wind.com/westwind.globalization, or grab one of our NuGet packages that you can simply import into Visual Studio. We're also on GitHub, where you can grab the source code and play around with it, or make a contribution. If you like the project, don't forget to start. Thanks for watching this video of the Westwind.Globalization library.